Hello and welcome to another Stellarian Games video. In this episode, we're going to be looking at how to make jungle trees. Sort of like this. They don't have canopies, but the idea was to make a tree that would be representative of a very tall tree, to be described as hundreds of feet tall, but on the tabletop it really needs to be a little bit smaller, so I just made the trunk for these jungle trees. These were a really great tool in one of my recent adventures, where the adventurers found a kind of a jungle terrain in the middle of a cavern where the ground split open and there was sunlight streaming in, and kind of an isolated ecosystem of a jungle in the middle of this mountainous region. So I wanted something to look a little bit more foreign, not really true jungle tree as in real life, but I wanted something that would have a little bit more fantastical feel to it, as well as kind of a reason for being really straight and tall, being there wouldn't be very much wind down in that cavern. So without further ado, let's go to the table and see how this is done. Okay, this project we're going to start off by cutting out some MDF bases for all of the trees. Just kind of making some basic oval shapes, nothing too fancy. Take him to the sander and sanding down the edges, kind of making a bevel along the edge. Then we're going to start making the root structure out of some 1/2 inch XPS. This I'm just making some angled cuts and then cutting it straight across. Then going vertical on the hot wire cutter to make them kind of irregularly shaped vertical root shapes. Then I'm using a utility knife and trying to go along the edge of all of those root sections to give them a little bit more of a beveled front, making them as irregular as possible to make it organic and natural looking. These don't have to be crazy good. I mean, this is just kind of a representation of the tall trees, but I wanted it to have a little bit more of a natural look. Now I'm using some insulation tubing that would go on the outside of like copper pipe and measuring just an even length and starting to hot glue on the roots. I put a dowel on the inside just so that I'd have something to hang on to as I'm doing my work. And then I started using some hot glue up and down the trunks of these trees, and that hot glue really dug into this insulation foam and melted it in very interesting ways. I included the root sections as well and tried to use that to give it a little bit more of a bark texture to the outside of those roots. I came along with that hot glue gun and really poked into each of them as well to give them a little bit more of almost a spongy look. I wanted these to be not really a true tree look, but I wanted it to have a really interesting organic feel. Then adding some extra detail along the MDF base as if the root is going into the ground as well, just texturing the base. Now using some white glue all along the edge of this whole piece and brushing it into place. I'm scattering on some sawdust to give the whole thing a little bit more of a texture on the outside. Then using white glue on the base and brushing that into place and sprinkling on some sand to give the ground some earth and texture. I'm taking that dowel that I was using to hold the trees earlier and cutting small little cap sections that will get glued into place on the top so that the tree doesn't look hollow from the top after it gets painted. Then I'm using some black paint and Mod Podge to coat the entire tree. These insulation tubes are a little bit soft, so the Mod Podge helps harden them up a little bit, but they still end up being a little bit soft. Now using a dark brown base coat over the entire thing, using pretty liberal amount of this dark brown to coat the whole base. Then I'm using this kind of sandy texture and dry brushed pretty heavily over it to pick out all the highlights. It highlights all that sawdust and divots that we hot glued into place earlier. Then kind of a departure from what I've done in the past, I'm using a little bit more of a white color. I wanted these to be kind of a pale looking tree, especially since they were going to be underground. There was kind of I just wanted it to be set apart a little bit different. Then on each of them, I'm using a black wash just to make sure that the texture still stands out, especially all those little holes that we put in. Once that's all fully dried, coming along with some white glue again and dotting in and filling in all sorts of areas of this tree. This will be for the green flocking. I'm using a brush to kind of spread that around so that it doesn't have too much of just a dot look of glue. It spreads a little bit more naturally along the trunk. Using this green flocking then and coating that whole thing. This really adds a layer of growth and dimension to these trees. Well, there it is. Here's the finished product. These trees really turned out pretty nice in my opinion, especially if you need ones that are really tall and beyond the scope of needing a canopy. I hope you like this video. If you do, please hit the like button and subscribe, and we'll see you again next time. Thank you.